Um, so last week, when we were having a catch-up, well, me and the four other speakers today have been amazing, we realized that we were all very passionate about inclusive research and design, and we were all kind of saying, well, I was kind of saying some like very similar things to what the other folks were saying, so I've kind of switched up the talk a little bit today, and yes, we are going to be talking about the 5 principles, but we're also going to be talking about basically, when I was having a conversation with somebody I was sitting next to today, I just thought, if everyone today leaves my talk thinking critically about the kind of technological world that we live in and how we do business or how we think about technology and research and design, that's going to be a win for me. So I'd like to introduce my research practice, which is 100 Kicks. Everyone always thinks something to do with shoes. It's absolutely not. It's actually my second name, which is Saulat. So in Hindi means 100 and Lat means kicks. So I just thought it was a really fun word play. So that's where the name comes from. And what is it designed for? It's basically my aim is to do product research and do it with care. So, as a lot of other speakers have said earlier, we're interested in building worlds that are equitable from the beginning, not just as an afterthought. So because care, in my opinion, is a long-term strategy, I think when we think about the word care, we think of it as this really feminine word, which seems really soft, but I think it has a real strategic element which lends itself to sustainable growth and having an inside-out approach, which is all about how can you care for your team and also allow them to carefully build things that are actually useful. The whole point was to do culturally competent research. So I know that we've been talking about words like inclusive design and accessibility, and I think this event is all about beyond accessibility. So I think when I think about it that way, for me, we're starting to move into this realm of how do we go beyond that? And I think one of the ways is through being culturally competent. So not just sensitive to the culture or the area that you're maybe researching or studying within, but actually trying to get competent and embedding yourself in that so that any team that you're working with can feel confident about the decisions that they're making, especially when they impact a global majority. So just a bit more about cultural competency. Like my words are just not really rolling off. Again, kind of alluding to what the speakers before me have said, it's about how, as a researcher, and even as a designer, as anyone in a specific business function, how can you try and have a way to engage with people from diverse cultural backgrounds? And how can you be aware of your own biases in being able to understand that? So bringing all those things together leads to a level of confidence. So you have an aligned team who have a shared belief and understanding so that you kind of get on to making solutions that make sense. So in terms of why my practice exists, it's because I got tired. And I was working in a lot of places, I'll talk about it in a bit, but I worked at big tech, I work at gov clients, and it was very much, we want to be inclusive and we really want to recruit diverse participants, but then when push came to shove, I felt like a lot of things that were being designed because product manager wants to get a promotion, not because it's actually useful for the users that you're trying to build for. I'm Afreen and I care. I want to be able to work in a world, as I'm sure all of you do, where we're building products that are actually useful. And sometimes I do care a little bit too much. So this is what I was alluding to. So I train as a sociologist, and my whole kind of ethos has been about questioning technological progress. Do we really need to build that thing? Not just should we build it, but how much of an impact is this going to have? But I was really naive when I came into the world of work. I thought, great, everyone's really out here to build stuff that's actually useful, and very quickly learned, working across lots and lots of different clients, that that's not really always the case. So, taking a step back and now kind of having that hindsight, I was able to question why this lack of care exists in the first place. And this is where it will be really great for everyone to kind of, have your own thoughts about what you're seeing in the places that you're working in. I personally think these are the reasons. Tech bro culture, which I think, has been transposed from Silicon Valley, whether that's in the kind of media that we watch or consume, and just the way we think about business. I think, it's bred a culture of, rampant harassment and discrimination. Love that. It also means outpricing the local community. So, San Francisco, for instance, is well known for the fact that, if you're claiming to be building for lots and lots of different people and lots of diverse communities, yet those diverse communities can't afford to live in the vicinity of where those companies are, kind of doesn't make sense. So that, I think, is one of the reasons. And ego-driven work practices. I think one of the other speakers spoke about this in terms of, I think it was you, about a type of trauma is, having a really shitty workplace. And this is one of the things that happens when you are working in a place where things are ego-driven, where your product manager just wants to get a promotion and not necessarily care about what it is that they're building. So it can be quite hard to start to think about inclusiveness and accessibility when we're existing in a world such as this. And work and life can be the same thing, right? Like, lots of companies will say, we'll provide you with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just stay here, we'll provide you with all these perks. And so it becomes really hard to break out of that golden cage and drink the Kool-Aid because, you are loving the Kool-Aid, but it becomes really hard to just break out of that and start to question the system. And I think, question the system is basically what I want everyone to be able to consider doing. So we did that. Basically, I took this idea about what would Silicon Valley have looked like had it not been conceived in the world that it has currently. What if it had been conceived in a non-Western context, for example? And we went to Mozilla Fest. Has anyone been to Mozilla Fest here before? No? You should all go. It's Mozilla who run Firefox. They run this festival every year where they talk about new ways of engaging with the internet. And I took the workshop there, and the first question I asked, it was a virtual workshop, was, the fiction versus reality of Silicon Valley. And these are some of the ideas that we got, So this is what people said are the myths. There's a lot of propaganda, it's aspirational, 5 a.m. hustle culture, for safe space, beyond human needs. There's an app for everything, move fast, break things, there will be money available, tech will save us. So I think, we've all bought into this idea of the Silicon Valley, right? But we wanted to actually bridge the gap, and I asked, okay, cool, but what's the reality that you're seeing on the ground? This is supposed to be Golden Gate Bridge, by the way. So this is the reality on the other side, which is actually that there's no community, Soylent Green/Huel, campus buses avoiding the others, startup culture is unsustainable, corporate culture with jeans and chinos. No community. Can they invest in local community, please? Efficiency over everything. So I think it's very clear that the myth of Silicon Valley versus the reality are two completely different things. And so whilst we might be aiming to be accessible, and that's what we might be positioned, especially big tech might be positioning things as, the reality on the ground is quite different, and it's not going to change until we start questioning these work practices. So what would a culturally competent tech world look like, where all the things that we've mentioned in our talks can actually realistically happen, where you're not having to convince your senior stakeholders that, hey, inclusive research is important, because they're like, that's just how we do research, or that's just not even something that we need to think about. We asked the question again in this workshop, what would values look like? There were words like equity, non-hierarchy, transparency, less jargon, sense of belonging. What does that mean in a team context? Can you have ways of being able to position things in a way that allows for that? What would interactions with the local community look like? So it might be local workspaces that are distributed throughout the country. Corporations have responsibility for impact on communities, especially where they have large HQs. So how can you give back within the spaces that you might be outpricing? Some sort of tax for large HQs which pour money into community projects. So some really, really amazing ideas in a way where like, you know, what we talked about earlier, I think some of the other projects touched upon this idea of going into spaces and meeting users. And I think allowing for users to exist in a space because you haven't outpriced them from the community is probably one way of being able to sustainably do that, especially for the future. What would the architecture look like? This was quite fun. Somebody came up with this in like mid-journey actually. But yeah, maybe it looks like having meetings outside. Maybe it looks like having a, you know, synergy with nature. Like I guess, you know, even what they've done here with the plants. It's about being environmentally sustainable. Or, you know, somebody who's joining from India said, can we reuse historical buildings in a way that breathes like new life into it? So this could be what a culturally competent tech world future could look like, which doesn't rely on, you know, the kind of tech bro landscape that we've become so used to. How would funding work? So maybe it's about collective effort, community-led, returns for many people, credit union, and investing locally. There's lots and lots of different ways to start thinking about these things as well. And yeah, just, I guess, a question to the room. What does culture mean to you? You can just say it, by the way. Anyone want to say a term? Sense of belonging, yeah? Anyone? Everyone's very shy. So I think the reason I want to ask this question is because the whole idea of cultural competency is this idea of becoming, you know, being beyond accessible, kind of really questioning the status quo and ensuring that people who you do research with even are comfortable and feel that they're being listened to. So it's about moving beyond just thinking, okay, how can I allow people to take part? It's just how can I make them feel like what we're building, they're a part of as well. So I'm just going to touch upon some ways that you can do that, which some of our other speakers have done as well. So this will just be a quick recap. Yeah, assessing your own biases. Actually, I had a similar age bias because I was doing some research with Camden Council on digital inclusion, and I went in thinking, oh, it only really impacts older people. But actually, we ended up doing research and we figured out that it actually exists on a massive spectrum, and it impacts young people quite a lot as well, especially when they don't have the right access to the tools that they need. So yeah, how can you do that in a setting which allows your team to put your assumptions together before you go out into the field? And remembering that your biases are not your hypotheses, so it's very easy to start thinking of it that way, right? It's more about an indicator of what might need to be uncovered. So I didn't go in there thinking, my hypothesis is that old people are impacted the most by being digitally excluded. My hypothesis was, you know, that there's many different types of people that might be excluded. Are there others that I haven't considered yet? So this helps you, you know, this helps you set up a research strategy that is ultimately culturally competent given the area that you're in. Working out in the open, I always like to work in Google Docs or anything that allows for people across the company to be a part of it, right? And I write my briefs in a really simple way so that even if you're somebody who works in a business where, I don't know, somebody's working in customer care, they can read my research and know exactly what it is that I'm trying to answer. And I think this is important because sometimes in design and research teams, we get so insular, we forget that there's other people in the company who might be really useful and might be able to provide you an insight into the question that you're trying to answer. So even with something like Camden Council, we figured that there were people who actually assist older folks or people who are not as digitally inclined with doing applications. And so that's the kind of customer service folks that might pick up the call from those people. So they gave us some really, really interesting insights, but they might not have been able to if they didn't understand what it is that we were trying to understand. So working in the open and working clearly is super important. And also, look at what's already been discovered as well. It might surprise you. There's no need to try and reinvent the wheel, right? Like, can you add to the conversation? So for example, for that piece of research, I found this amazing periodic table of internet elements from the Good Things Foundation. And this is great because, so it shows you all the kind of different things that people might need to use. So if you're like, you know, maybe you need your test results or you want to apply for housing, finances, so different internet elements. And I use this with my participants. So I would present this to them in a research session and say, hey, of these things, which ones do you find the easiest to do? and which ones do you find the most difficult to do? And what we ended up doing was actually adding to this column. We added a whole section on security, and because it was post-COVID, and it actually turns out loads of people were really worried about getting scammed. And so yeah, how can you add to existing research that already highlights most of the issues that you're trying to figure out? Multi-perspective analysis, so a few of the speakers have already touched on this, but this idea of how can you, see a certain question differently. And this is where I say making your research accessible is quite important, because you can do your research, get your analysis, but get a fresh pair of eyes across the business or the team that you're in to give you a different perspective or tell you, hey, I noticed this thing, did you pick up on that? And yeah, taking care of logistics and creating the right research environment. So that means, accessible involvement. How can you allow your kind of research participants to show up in a way where they feel heard? Can they do it remotely? I think some of our other speakers have covered this in a bit more detail, but this is just me kind of bringing this back. And a comfortable environment. Is the venue accessible? Is there parking available? Is the temperature warm enough? Are there enough toilets? If you're serving food, have any allergies been accounted for? Incentivizing, there's simple incentive calculators available online as well if you're struggling with figuring out exactly how much you want to be able to give. Also, if you're working with businesses who are really small or who don't have access to loads of funds, are there other ways that you can incentivize people that doesn't necessarily have to be money? And yeah, making people feel seen and heard. Try and, when you're doing your research sessions, make sure that you're obviously asking how and why questions, using the right pronouns, asking them how to pronounce their name, and aiming for a 70-30 ratio of mainly them speaking and you mainly listening and kind of asking follow-up questions. And yeah, because in my mind, cultural competency also means designing with care. So that's the term that I brought up earlier. And I kind of want to come back to this. So these are the 5 principles. So this now kind of sets the stage for why I came up with those. After a year of existing as a practice, as a research practice, we kind of sat down. I say we because it was another strategist who I was working with, and looked at the journey so far. And these were the kind of projects that we were involved in. So there was one which was about genomics, and it was all about predictions. It was looking at if somebody's got a, basically it was doing work to see how you can predict if somebody is going to develop something later on down the line. There was also a really wild marine insurance client who were wanting help with figuring out how a insurance policy renewal process would go ahead. And then there was a really another predictive element project with Dulux, where they were trying to look at homelessness data, MOJ data, and NHS data to predict the likelihood of somebody going back into prison or ending up back on the streets. And when we kind of looked at all of this and reflected on it, when I reflected on it, basically what we realized was there's this real interesting thread of a lot of projects which are all centered around this idea of predicting or making sense of data and making predictions about the future. So we came up with these principles because looking back at these, I was like, a lot of these companies are doing some quite dangerous stuff in wanting to predict the outcomes of what will happen to people without necessarily thinking about what kind of impact that might have. And so these are the 5 principles. So it's how can we start to design for flexibility and adaptability? If we are making predictions, can there be person-centric predictions? Can we design while taking into account biases? Can we design for active contribution, responsibility, and empowerment? And finally, for increasing transparency around the human knowledge that might have gone into building that product and service. These are a lot, and it's kind of impossible to be able to do all of them, especially given the current sort of world that we exist in. And so, again, I did another workshop at MozFest, which was how can we apply these principles to existing apps and services. And one that I want to take you through is, funnily enough, a dating app. How would you redesign a dating app with care? How many of you have enjoyed using dating apps here? Put your hand up. How many of you absolutely hated it? Put your hand up. Yeah, I thought so. I'm obviously in that category. So we got people to reapply those principles. And so, for example, if we applied the first principle, which is about flexibility and adaptability through ongoing communication, let's imagine that you went on a really crappy date. Imagine you were able to go on there and say, oh, actually, I didn't have that great a time, and then the app kind of guides you to perhaps talking to a therapist, right, or designing some form of check-in. If a dating app was designed with care, that is something that it would do. Secondly, individualized analysis and person-centric predictions. Who here knows how a dating app algorithm works? Because I really don't. And, I think it's about, what if it was designed with care, instead of making me feel bad about myself for not getting the right type of matches, maybe I could see it as a reflective tool rather than one to gain validation through. And the matching algorithm might offer some very transparent insights into how it curates these potential matches and what that's got to do with, who I am and who I'm becoming. Designing whilst taking into account biases that are underpinning design decisions. And I think this speaks to what a lot of other folks have spoken about as well, this idea of, how can you consider your team's own experiences and thoughts before you implement a practice? And so instead of just putting in, oh, this is what a user said and this is why we made this decision, can we also document why we've made design decisions from the perspective of the design team? Like, what can we document? Is that something that we can start to think about as well? Because there are humans involved in building this thing, right? Not just the people that we've done research with. And this is useful because it allows somebody like me as a researcher to ask better, more meaningful questions, because we as a team have been really honest about what our own biases might be. Design for active contribution, responsibility, and empowerment, which, is a favorite word today. And this is something where, if it came to a dating app, would allow users to communicate effectively to the people that work within the dating app. How many of you have had a complaint that you've sent on a dating app, for instance, and never really heard back? You don't really know what happens to that. You don't know if that situation's been dealt with, and especially if it's if somebody quite terrifying or abusive, how do you know that that's been looked after? How can you have that peace of mind? So, if a dating app was designed with care, maybe it would actually think about, we would think about ways of being able to kind of make people feel better about what's going on and say, hey, by the way, we are looking after that complaint that you complained about, we're doing something about it. And finally, for increasing transparency around human knowledge involved in building the product or service, this is really difficult, and this is one that I've been thinking about a lot, but I think, in general, we are now beginning to understand that algorithms, big data, AI, they're all fed on actual human knowledge and data. And we kind of forget that because they work like magic, right? But is there a way to start quantifying and being really honest about what's fed into this? Because that's what then leads to bias, right? Like, isn't ChatGPT run on mainly Reddit data? And who uses Reddit? That's mainly the Western world and a lot of middle-class white men, which is probably not going to be very reflective of the issues that people from diverse backgrounds who might be wanting to use it won't be able to answer those questions, right? So can there be extra transparency regarding data collection, how it's being used, how it's being saved, how it's being processed, to foster that real trust between any sort of service and product? So ultimately, it's hard to, of course, apply these. This is an imaginary world where a dating app has been designed with care. And the reason it's an imaginary world is because we currently live in a world which is, what I said earlier, kind of tech bro-driven, where we don't really always care about community. And so I challenge you all to think about, challenging the status quo and the way that we work. So in my mind, to go beyond accessibility, we need to reimagine our worlds, allowing space for collaborative redefinition. So how can we all get together to redefine how we do tech, how we think about the way we run our companies, how we work in those companies, and how we view each other. So go beyond and go care. And that's it.